Hello, this is Dr. Martin, and what we're going to do now is kind of walk through the slides from Chapter 1. This is a PowerPoint presentation from McGraw-Hill, and this can be downloaded right here in this particular module for week 2. This is Chapter 1 in McGraw-Hill Hofnagel's book on biology, and the very first chapter is on the scientific study of life. Now, there's 3 sections in this chapter, and I'll try to have 3 different links for the 3 different sections in this chapter. Let's dig right in, and we have to learn how to take notes. Whatever you have to do to write on your own, a legal pad or type or whatever, but you need to learn how to take some notes. And just know that I'm going to kind of hit the highlights here. You have to use the chapter to kind of fill in the lines or between the lines. I'm just going to hit the highlights, or else this is going to be a 2, 3, 4 hour lecture, and you don't want that, and I don't want that either. So you have to use your time to kind of build your own study guide for each of these sections. So let's dig right in with the scientific study of life here in Hofnagel's text, in your text, chapter 1. Hey, right here, this is biology, so let's just define what biology is. Biology, bio means life. Logy means the study of, so this is the study of life, the study of living things, all forms of life. And what we as scientists do is we kind of have to define what life is, because there's a lot of different definitions out there. So we have to clarify what life is, since biology is the study of life. And really, that's what this first section of chapter 1 is about, is this defining what life is. What are the characteristics of life? The basic unit of all life, however complex or simple, is that all life is comprised of cells. This is a theory that came out in the 1700s by 2 scientists called Schleiden and Schwann, and they developed this cell theory that all life is comprised of cells. Every organism is comprised of cells. You can see on this slide here on the left, this is a paramecium, a one-celled organism, exists as a single cell. But most organisms are complex, multicellular organisms. But hey, as long as they're comprised of cells, then we define it as life. So all living things have DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. That's why we just call it DNA. So all living things have DNA that are found inside of the cell and are used to manufacture other cells for that organism. You pass on DNA to your offspring. Your parents passed on DNA to you. So it's something that's passed on from parent to offspring, DNA. But there are 5 other additional characteristics of life that we use to define life. Hey, just as a side note here, are viruses living? Scientists don't classify viruses as living things because they don't have all of these characteristics of living things. They may have 1 or 2, but they don't have all of these characteristics of living things. Now, you know what viruses are, and you know what they can cause, the damage they can cause, but we don't classify them as living things. The search for life in other biospheres and in other planets, how do we define life? So you understand the importance of clearly defining the characteristics of living things. We already talked about cells, talked about DNA. Now let's talk about 5 shared characteristics of living things. And let's kind of walk through these 5 things. This is we're going to talk a lot about this, but I think you're going to pick up pretty quick what we're talking about here. But all living things, all life on Earth exhibits an organization or a hierarchy of complexity, starting with really basic, simple things, and then building those into much more complex systems. Life is very organized. We'll kind of walk through this, and you're going to catch on pretty quick to what we're talking about. First of all, the smallest unit of of all matter on Earth is what we call it's. Remember the definition of matter from your junior high science class? Matter is anything that has mass and occupies some space. Well, that's matter. So it's basically everything, even things you can't see. The things you're breathing right now that you can't see. They're odorless, they're tasteless, but they're oxygen. You're breathing out carbon dioxide. There's some ozone in there. And so even things you can't see that are too microscopic for you to see are comprised of matter. Anything that has mass and occupies space. Well, we use matter to make up atoms. Atoms is the smallest unit of any substance, living or non-living. It's an atom, and we're going to talk more about atoms in the next couple of chapters. Atoms are used to build molecules, larger molecules, like DNA, which is indicated here, the DNA molecule. So molecules are structures that are comprised of atoms, and then your cells are comprised of organelles, like here a chloroplast, which is used to trap sunlight in plants and in green plants. And you kind of see what we're doing here. We're building in complexity. Life is built on complexity. And then organelles are used to comprise cells of all living things. Some are complex, some are very simple, some are larger, some are smaller, but organelles are used to build cells. And then we use organelles in higher organisms like us to make tissues, tissues of skin, bone, ligament, cartilage, muscle. All of these are tissues that are comprised of similar cells. Nervous tissue, nerve tissue, comprised of all nerve cells. So cells are used to comprise tissues. And then tissues are used to make organs. The eye of the human eye is considered probably the most complex organ on earth of any organism. But there are other organs. Skin is an organ. You know the organs of the body, the heart, liver, kidneys. All of those are organs. Higher organisms have these more complex organs. So you see what we're doing here. We're building very simple, and life is organized into levels of complexity. And ultimately we have organ systems, the digestive system, the respiratory system, the nervous system. And you see what we're doing here. We're simply building in complexity. And then organisms, higher organisms, especially like ourselves, are comprised of these organ systems. Life exists along all levels of that hierarchy, from simple to complex. Some organisms exist as a single cell. We call them unicellular organisms, one-celled organisms like bacteria, amoebas. These are one-celled organisms, but we are multicellular organisms. So life exists along all hierarchies from cell and higher into higher organisms. But hey, in ecology, I'm an ecologist, we go even beyond that. We have what we call ecological levels of organization, where organisms are grouped into populations, populations of humans, populations of bass in a lake like Grand Lake, population of snails in a forested habitat, the population of foxes in a forested habitat in eastern Oklahoma. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species that occupies a certain area. So this is the ecological levels of organization. We group populations into communities, which are multiple organisms of plants, animals living in a certain area. And that's what we'll call a community. So we have populations, all the same organism or all the same species. We have communities, which is bigger and broader. You see what we're doing. We're building in complexity here. An ecosystem is even broader than communities. The area is larger. It's living, non-living matter, and For instance, in eastern Oklahoma, you kind of have the forested Ozark ecosystem of eastern Oklahoma. You have the grassland ecosystem of central and western Oklahoma. Here in the west in Colorado, where I'm at, we have the mountainous ecosystem. So you see what we're doing. We're starting smaller with populations. We're building the communities. We're building the ecosystems, and we build even larger to what we call the biosphere, which is the entire layer around the earth where life can exist, where we can support life. And that's what we call the biosphere. And so you see what we're doing here. We built in levels of complexity, levels of organization. And life, all living things exhibit these levels of organization. Pretty interesting reading here on emergent properties. Usually don't include this too much into our levels of organization or hierarchy, but it is interesting to read what emergent properties are that arise at each level of this organization of life. Pretty interesting to read here. And there's some examples here of what we mean by emergent properties. We interject some questions here, some clicker questions. We don't necessarily click or answer these, but these are some pretty common questions that you'll see eventually as we assess your learning in this particular section. Things like this here, if you could identify A through E, which of these following statements are false? Hey, I'm going to let you walk through those, and hey, these are not for a grade, just so you'll kind of understand what kind of things how we're going to ask and how we're going to word questions when we assess your learning on an exam later here in a few weeks. And there's the answer there. Molecules consist of cells. What's the best example of an emergent property here? A through E. And B, welding metal together, making an office building is an emergent property. So there's some other 5 characteristics. Remember we said there's 2 primary characteristics of living things, cells and DNA. But now we're talking about 5 additional characteristics of living organisms. First was levels of organization, levels of complexity. Here we want to talk about energy. Life requires energy. Now I don't know what time of day is you're watching this, but at some point during today, you consumed energy. You ate some energy. Plants make their energy from sunlight. You eat your energy, whether it was carbohydrates, maybe it was protein, maybe it was a fat diet. Whatever diet is, your body uses what you eat to support all of the physiology that goes on in your body. But hey, you're a higher organism. All organisms require energy. All cells require energy. So this is one of the key. We could talk about this forever, but all living things require energy. Some organisms are what we call producers. The primary producers use sunlight to make their own energy. Plants do this. We're going to talk about photosynthesis. This is photosynthesis. We're going to talk about this as we go through the semester. But primary producers, they use sunlight energy to make their food. Then we have consumers like ourselves that they have to consume whatever you ate for lunch or dinner or breakfast today. You're a consumer. You consume your energy and your nutrients. And so life is made up of producers, consumers, and then there are decomposers on the other end of that decompose life. And usually fungi fall into this category. Bacteria fall into this category. Sometimes we underestimate the importance of decomposers in our systems, in our life systems. So producers, consumers, and then decomposers. And another characteristic here is we've talked about organization, we've talked about energy. Here's another one. It's called internal consistency, what we call homeostasis. Homeo means same. Hetero means different. Homeostasis means the same. Notice the 2 pictures. This person on a very hot day and on a very cold day. We as higher organisms, we have the ability to regulate homeostasis internally. We have an internal consistency. Some other organisms can't do that. But organisms like ourselves, birds are another one. We maintain a very constant homeostatic environment. It's maintaining internal equilibrium. Normally, what we're doing here is we're talking about heat and water, heat balance, water balance, maintaining a constant balance, especially temperature. We spend most of our time on temperature here, what we call homeostasis. We have the ability, we have an internal thermostat. Uh, Remember the average body temperature for humans in Celsius, it's 37 degrees. Fahrenheit, what? I'll let you figure that one out. But 37 degrees, 98.6 for Fahrenheit. So that's our constant body temperature. So we maintain a constant. That's what we call homeostasis. It's not just about temperature. Usually it's heat balance, but it's also water balance, but also just an entire physiological balance. What we call an internal constancy or internal consistency of heat and water. And then another of these 5 characteristics is reproduction, growth, and development. All living things reproduce. All living things grow. All living things develop. This is one of those 5 classic characteristics. Now, we can reproduce as organisms. We can reproduce asexually. That means there's no transfer of sperm and egg. There's no use of gametes or sperm and egg. Asexual reproduction is only a single parent involved. It's just cloning is a weak way of describing this. There's only a single parent involved or a single cell involved, where one cell divides into 2, what we call asexual reproduction. Whereas sexual reproduction is the use of gametes, sex cells, sperm and egg in humans. Now, if we want to humanize it, but plants reproduce usually sexually by using pollen. The flowers of a plant have both male and female reproductive parts, and so sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Anytime we put an A in front of a word, it's the opposite. Sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Organisms grow. I always use the analogy that yes, all living things grow. Can non-living things grow? Are there some non-living substances out there that can increase in size? Some of you are thinking ahead of me here. Stalactites, stalagmites inside of caves, snowflakes on a snowy day. So yes, some non-living substances of matter can increase in size, but I think you and I we're smart enough to understand the difference in growth of organisms versus non-living matter, which is pretty isolated. So yes, all living things grow. They increase in size. They develop, changes that occur as an organism matures. So all living things grow. Here's some questions again. Which of these following statements is true about reproduction? There's the answer to that question, but you can walk through these and this just as a side note, this slideshow is in another section of this module. You can download this slideshow. You don't have to necessarily listen to this audio to walk through this slideshow. And so here we are. The 5 additional characteristics of living things. They have an organization, they consume energy, they have an internal constancy or consistency, they reproduce, they grow, they develop, and also they evolve. Life evolves over time. Sometimes it's long periods of time, seasons of time, but all living things evolve. We can also say it this way: all living things respond to a stimulus. We respond or we evolve over time. Usually this occurs by nature selecting towards certain types of responses in favor of certain responses, and maybe not in favor of less favorable responses. We call these genes. Genes are passed on from parents to offspring. and these are the components that were passed on to you from your parents. And so these genes oftentimes will select for or against certain traits over long periods of time. And every organism has these genes. Every organism, this is DNA, this is what we're talking about before. All living things have this DNA. Well, all living things respond or they evolve over time. Even the most simple organisms, you're going to, if you were to take this class in a laboratory setting, all living things even respond, simple organisms can respond to light or heat. All living things respond or evolve. They have that innate evolutionary capacity to respond. And organisms that survive will reproduce. Those that don't survive simply do not. Organisms with the most competitive capabilities will survive. Organisms with the most complex DNA relative to their immune systems will survive. And those that don't simply don't. So life evolves, living things evolve, living things respond. Um, and this is what we're talking about here, where the environment or nature simply selects towards favorable adaptations, favorable responses, as opposed to unfavorable responses. The ability to become resistant. You've heard this term in the common media about resistant bacteria, how even the most simple organisms like bacteria can respond to antibiotics. Resistance. They develop a resistance over time, and that's becoming quite a complex issue in our health industry. So even the most here you are, the antibiotic resistant bacteria is the MRSA is what we're talking about here. And so even the most simple organisms have the ability to select for beneficial adaptations versus others who cannot. So these are the 5 additional characteristics, in addition to DNA and cells, 5 additional characteristics of living organisms. Hey, walk through these very closely. Make your own worksheet, make your own notes using the slideshow in the other link in the module. Walk through the chapter of your text to begin to make your own your own little study guide as you walk through these things. This is what we're talking about. Create a concept map. Whatever you have to do to create your own slideshow to help you here. Now, we'll start on a separate subject, a separate section of notes on section 1.2 in another link.